So the Greenland situation, it's getting worse. In fact, here's a Danish politician just a couple hours ago pretty well summing up how a lot of our European allies are feeling right now.
Let me put this in words you might understand. Mr. President, fuck off.
Now, look, I don't know what the breaking point is or really what that would even mean, but we are certainly in uncharted territory as President Trump continues to make open military and economic threats against our NATO allies. So let's try to get up to speed with where things stand. Now, 2 days ago, President Trump released the text message exchange that he had with the leaders of Norway and Sweden, where he said, quote, "Considering your country decided not to give me the Nobel Peace Prize for having stopped 8 wars plus, I no longer feel an obligation to think purely of peace. The world is not secure unless we have complete and total control of Greenland." Now, there is a lot to unpack in that wall of text there, but here's the deal. So much has happened, and the responses to this have been kind of spiraling out of control in the last 48 hours. We're just going to move on. So NBC News, asking the president later that day about this message, asked if he was planning on using force to seize Greenland, U.S. military forces. Simple answer there, right? Of course not. This is a NATO ally. What are you talking about, guys? We can work through our differences. Wrong. President Trump said no comment. He then went on to say, and I'm not kidding, quote, "I don't care about the Nobel Prize," which is, a little bit contradictory, or directly contradictory to what he said earlier in the day and what he's been saying and how he's been acting over the course of this administration. But here's the thing. Everything around the arguments that the United States needs to take Greenland, be it through force or through economic means, purchasing it, even though Greenland and Denmark says it's not for sale, all of those justifications are contradictory. In fact, really what this boils down to, my personal opinion, is President Trump just wants more territory. In fact, it seems to be evidenced by some posts he made earlier today showing that the United States extends over Greenland, over Canada, Venezuela, and more. If you view all of this through that lens, that President Trump just wants to take over more land, it makes more sense because the most kind of the dominant narrative right now is around national security. That doesn't land at all. Like, that doesn't make sense. Yes, Greenland is important for U.S. national security, which is why, it falls under the NATO umbrella, which is why we have a military base there, which is why we have air defense radars there. And we've got this great arrangement right now with Greenland and with Denmark where we can do really whatever we want militarily. If we wanted to 10x the number of troops we have there and build 17 more air defense sites and extend the Golden Dome and do all sorts, we can. That's part of the deal. And the great thing about how it sits right now is we're not actually responsible for the governance of the people of Greenland. It's kind of the best of both worlds, if you will. But no, the arguments now are we need to physically take it so we can do those things that we already can do today. Again, the national security argument here does not actually hold up to very much scrutiny at all. Now, in looking at some of the responses that are pouring in, not great. We've done a pretty good job of upsetting our closest allies, but pleasing Russia, I should mention. Looking over there, they're saying this is actually pretty good, lines up very much with what we're doing in Crimea. Denmark's prime minister said because President Trump has not ruled out using military force over Greenland, quote, "we cannot rule it out either." The Belgian prime minister said if someone says, "I want to take NATO territory from you or else I'll start a trade war," then we start a trade war. And it does seem, unfortunately, like that's the direction we're heading. And I know folks will say that doesn't make sense. In fact, Secretary Bessent here in a second will claim he doesn't believe Europe has any cards at all to play here. I think what we're missing is that European voters have agency, and we've upset a lot of people around the world. And they're going to demand action, not just sitting down and taking this, but pushing back against some of these words and actions now by the United States. Another Danish politician here, Christopher Storm, said, quote, "There's nothing wrong with Americans, but there is with Trump." He noted that Denmark has stood alongside the United States in wars, with Danes paying their lives, adding that Trump should not threaten a European country with force. British politician Nigel Farage, talking to Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, who's in the UK today or recently, said, "Hey, look, man, this is a real problem you've been stirring up."
Let's be frank. Friends can disagree in private, and that's fine. Mm-hmm. And that's part of life, part of politics. But to have a US president threatening tariffs, unless we agree that he can take over Greenland by some means without, it seems, even getting the consent of the people of Greenland. I mean, this is a very hostile act. There's no other way I can put it.
And then just a few hours ago at Davos, French President Emmanuel Macron said U.S. tariff threats are, quote, fundamentally unacceptable, warning that they're being used as a tool against territorial sovereignty and to undermine Europe's exports. In terms of the economic side of this, which does seem like the direction this is heading, the European Parliament has announced that they have put on hold the U.S.-EU trade deal that had been negotiated over the course of the last few months. And a Danish pension fund just a few hours ago announced that they plan to sell all of its U.S. Treasury holdings by the end of January, citing credit risks associated with President Trump's policies. Their chief investment officer said, quote, "The U.S. is basically not a good credit, and long-term, the U.S. government finances are not sustainable." Now, a key note there, this is a relatively small drop in the bucket. A note has that that pension fund has around $100 million in U.S. Treasuries. So not massive. Wrong direction, though. Again, we've talked about this in recent videos. Self-inflicted gunshot wound. We don't need to do this. Why are we not just talking to our allies that are open to us adding more resources, adding more military personnel to the Arctic, to Greenland? Instead, we are causing a lot of damage here. But I get the impression, and we'll play some clips here from the United States as we shift into our response here domestically. The U.S. kind of has the view right now, or at least the Trump administration, that there's nothing Europe can do here. In fact, President Trump a couple days ago said, we're going to do this either the easy way or the hard way. We're going to take action whether you like it or not. And that appears to be kind of the view, is Europe doesn't have the ability to do anything at all about this, kind of echoed today in Davos by Secretary of the Treasury Scott Bessent.
Just to follow into that, so you do not believe that the EU or the UK have any retaliatory financial instruments or measures in their bag that the United States should be worried about?
No.
And then kind of turning to more U.S. responses here, we have U.S. Republican Senator Schmidt talking about how Europe needs to stand by and let the United States acquire Greenland.
Europe, in many ways, has been subsidized by the taxpayers of the United States for their social welfare programs for far too long. They need to step up in a much more meaningful way for their own defense and also move forward with the United States in allowing us to acquire Greenland.
They better get serious about their own defense, because they're in no position. NATO is in no position. Western Europe is in no position to defend itself without us.
And that was part of a longer conversation he had with Sean Hannity, where Hannity was really laying out that entire segment. It was just kind of making the pitch as to why Greenland is necessary for the United States. But again, the national security arguments there fall apart with the slightest bit of scrutiny. It is important to U.S. national security. There has been no rational explanation given yet as to why we can't do today what we could do if we purchased it and shattered the NATO alliance in the process. The closest we get, the only thing in that direction, is it's different if we own it. That's it. Like, there's been no explanation of what we've tried to do that Denmark or Greenland hasn't allowed, or how exactly we would treat it differently. In fact, I would argue that saying that we will defend it more if we own it than if it's a part of Denmark is kind of undermining NATO's Article 5, right? Kind of a backhanded way of saying, maybe we would, maybe we wouldn't defend all NATO territory. Now, there's been pushback in the United States from the Democratic Party and people outside of politics, outside of the current government, which is kind of how it works, right? You're always going to get the other side pushing back against anything. Inside the Republican Party, not much at all, mostly silence, to be honest. Here is the Senate Majority Leader, Tom Tillis, earlier today, kind of saying, no, military force, even if that happens, I don't know, maybe we'll do like a resolution to limit exactly what could happen.
There are some other Republican senators who have raised the issue as well. I believe Senator McConnell has said that if the president goes ahead with this moves on Greenland, if something were to happen there, that this would be something that other Republican senators would move to impeach him on. Are you in that camp?
Well, I'm not going to go to impeachment, because I would go to the process of implementing, let's say it was a kinetic action or some sort of increase in military presence, that I'd immediately go for a war powers resolution. I think that we could easily get veto-proof majorities. That's why I'm trying to advise the president. We need to project power from Greenland. We can do that.
Now, one group that is certainly happy here is Russia. Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister, earlier today said, this is very similar to our situation in Crimea. He says Crimea is critical for Russian security, just like Greenland is critical for U.S. security. The State Department, on their website, as of right now, says, quote, in February 2014, Russian forces entered Ukraine's Crimean Peninsula and occupied it militarily. In March of 2014, Russia announced the peninsula had become part of the Russian Federation following a sham referendum that violated Ukraine's constitution. Don't love it. Don't love it that Russia is looking at what the entire world, outside of like China and North Korea and Belarus, said, hey, that's illegal. You shouldn't do that. You're just taking over a territory, saying it's yours against the will of the people, not recognized by the United Nations. And not great that Russia is pointing to that, saying, see? Greenland, same deal. Russian media Rybar is pointing out that this is causing a pretty significant distraction from, the ongoing war with Russia. And we'll get back to that here in a second. How, if we're actually concerned about Russia, why are we doing things to distract from the war that Russia is in? Rybar says, quote, what is clearly visible at the moment is that the Ukrainian issue has been very quickly pushed to the background. The conference in Davos is mostly dedicated to the Greenland problem, and hardly anyone is talking about Ukraine in recent days. It's not hard to guess how this affects the mood in Kyiv. And they say in this situation, while everyone is focused on Greenland, it's the perfect time to consolidate success. Now, adding to all of this craziness is the new Trump Board of Peace, which strangely plays in here as well. Putin has been invited. Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov said, quote, President Putin has indeed received an offer through diplomatic channels to join this Board of Peace. We are currently studying all the details of this proposal. We hope to contact the U.S. side to clarify all of the details. We also got news that the Belarusian President Lukashenko has been invited to this Trump Peace Council. So Russia is so much of a threat that we need to, threaten economic and military action against our NATO allies so we can protect Greenland. But also, let's pull them into this Peace Council. Here's the thing. The traditional U.S. allies, like France, said they're out. They're not going to join this. They don't like... Look, the Peace Council thing is wild. It has the chairman as President Trump, not the United States. And when Trump is out of office, he is still the chairman. And then he gets to select whoever takes over after he's gone. It's like standing up a separate international order. If another country put this forward, we would laugh them out of the room. It's kind of odd in so many different ways. And France looked at this and said, yeah, we're not going to do that. So President Trump responded earlier today by saying that he would layer 300% tariffs on French wine and champagne. Now, we've got reports that the United Kingdom, Germany, Netherlands, and Sweden plan to follow France's lead, saying we're not going to join this ridiculous thing. And this is where this, again, the national security argument about Greenland just falls apart. We need Greenland because, as President Trump is saying over and over and over and over again, Russia and China. Russia is such a significant threat that we need to risk breaking apart the NATO alliance that, stands with us on the Russia issue. But in the meantime, we're going to stop arms shipments to Ukraine, where the war with Russia is happening right now. We're also not going to layer any new tariffs or sanctions on Russia, but we will layer tariffs, economic warfare, on our European allies that are members of NATO that are trying to push back against Russia. We're inviting Putin to this peace council, but then threatening tariffs for our allies if they don't want to join. Do you see how, again, the national security argument here, pushing back against Russia, makes no sense, falls apart very quickly. Now, in looking at some of the assessments here, an interesting one that I got from was a piece from Robert Kagan called America versus the World, published in The Atlantic, called out by Dan Carlin, podcaster, history podcaster, does some great work here. But they relate what we're seeing right now to Germany in World War I, saying, quote, Trump's megalomania is transforming the United States from international leader into international pariah, and the American people will suffer the consequences for years to come. Germany's chancellor in 1916 worried that his nation's behavior risked making it the mad dog among nations and would provoke the condemnation of the entire civilized world. He was right. German leaders were proud of their unflinching realism and believed that the frank and brutal pursuit of self-interest was simply what nations did. But as the historian Paul Kennedy noted, Germany's constant appeal to the code of naked power politics helped unite the world's great powers in bringing about Germany's defeat. And turning to Shashank Joshi, the defense editor at The Economist, yesterday published what I think is a pretty good summary here. He says, quote, right now, a real risk of a spiral. Europeans who are already using unprecedented language, blackmail, intimidation, threat, refuse to back down or push back with retaliatory tariffs. U.S. then expands coercion from tariffs to security. Could start by suspending weapons sales for Ukraine and halting intel sharing again. Then step up to actions directly hurting NATO, such as withdrawing select forces from Europe. The administration believes it has escalation dominance and that Europe will fold. And again, that's kind of what Scott Bessent hinted at in his interview in Davos earlier today. He says, then there are also some of the admin who believe a step back from NATO would be healthy and desirable. He says, easily this is the most serious crisis in the transatlantic relationship in either of Trump's two terms, perhaps since Suez. And then Ann Applebaum, also writing in The Atlantic yesterday, said Trump's letter to Norway should be the last straw. Quote, for the past year, American allies around the world have tried very hard to find a theory that explains Trump's behavior. Isolationism, neo-imperialism, patrimonialism, probably got that word wrong. All are the words that have been thrown around. But in the end, the president himself defeats all attempts to describe the Trump doctrine. He is locked into a world of his own, determined to win every encounter, whether in an imaginary competition for the Nobel Peace Prize or a protest from the mother of small children objecting to his masked, armed paramilitary in Minneapolis. These contests matter more to him than any long-term strategy. And of course, the need to appear victorious matters much more than Americans' prosperity and well-being. She says the people around Trump could find ways to stop him, as some did in his first term, but they seem too corrupt or too power-hungry to try. That leaves Republicans in Congress as the last barrier. They owe it to the American people and to the world to stop Trump from acting out his fantasy in Greenland and doing permanent damage to American interests. He is at risk of alienating friends in not only Europe but also India, whose leader he also snubbed for failing to nominate him for a Nobel Prize, as well as South Korea, Japan, Australia. Years of careful diplomacy, billions of dollars in trade are now at risk because senators and representatives who know better have refused to use the powers they have to block him. Now is the time. Now, in terms of what to watch for going forward here, it does look like the markets are already reacting to the possibility of a trade war. Is that going to be enough for President Trump to back down and declare victory? I don't think it's completely out of the question that, NATO has already and has been for a while talking about increasing security posture in Greenland focused on the Arctic threat. It's not out of the question that President Trump in the next 24, 48 hours will say, great news, everyone, mission accomplished. NATO is standing up additional forces in Greenland. We did it. Art of the deal. We accomplished everything we were looking for. I think that's possible. I would argue that we've done an awful lot of unnecessary damage along the way that may or may not be recoverable. And again, pointing back to the European voters. I think we make the mistake here in the United States of viewing Europe as a single entity. Maybe it's a podium, or it's the European Union, or it's a select 1, 2, or 3 leaders at a time, not recognizing that they do react to the will of their voters. And if enough voters stand up and get frustrated with and embarrassed with how the United States is treating them, the politicians are going to respond. And even if a trade war is a net loss for both of us, it does seem right now like there are plenty of calls across Europe from the people, the voters, to do something like that, to actually respond and stand up to the language and the actions being used by President Trump so far in this administration. But either way, not great. Russia loves it. China loves it. Our allies abroad, we're kind of pushing them back left and right. I hate to see this. It's hard to come up with I can't come up with a justification as to why we're doing this outside of President Trump wants more territory, to be honest. But that's where things sit for now. Thanks for watching, and I'll see y'all next time.